So welcome everyone to Design Leadership Season 3, the Fire Session about design maturity. Design is one of the most important aspects of any company. It can be the difference between the success and failure among business all over the world. That's why it's important to have a good design leadership and maturity in place to ensure that the teams it's always growing and learning. That's where our global ambassador, Joko Muratovic, comes in today. He's our global design ambassador at ECHOS and also director at Digital Futures at the King University. He's joined by Karel Vandenberg, IBM Global Vice President of Clients Insights and Research, who will be talking with us about design maturity and the design leadership journey. This is a great opportunity for us to learn from those two experts in the field, and we are very glad to have you both here at Design Leadership. So I'm going to pass the word for Joko and Karel, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Erika. So as you said, my special guest today is Karel Vandenberg, the Global Vice President of Client Insights and Research at IBM. In this role, Karel is responsible for leading the IBM user research community. And beyond this, Karel is also responsible for leading some of the most ambitious design endeavors at IBM, including the design unit, which governs a team of 3,000 designers. Karel, great to see you again, and thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be with you. Look forward to our conversations.
Thanks. Well, IBM is a fascinating company, and many of my design heroes were involved with IBM at one point or another. And since the mid-1950s, IBM has had a strong commitment to design. Thomas J. Watson Jr., the chairman and CEO who was instrumental in introducing the IBM design vision, declared that good design is good business. Ever since, this statement has become a mantra in the design world. At the time, Watson Jr. hired the design consultant Elliot Noyes to develop the IBM Design Philosophy and a new corporate design program. In many ways, this design program is still in use even today. But how has the design philosophy of IBM evolved since the mid-1950s, and how does this philosophy look like now?
A great question, Joko, and it has been a long history of design at IBM. And Elliot Noyes was interestingly, he was hired and he insisted on being a consultant and not an employee, so that he could actually set up a program, so he could be totally honest and open when things weren't working well. And I think that was actually an interesting way to start with a company that wasn't necessarily embracing design at the time. He was also an architect, so he actually designed many of the buildings that we're in, put a lot of effort into really the industrial design of our products back then. And the majority of IBM's products back then were hardware products, right? Products that you need industrial design for. And so he was really instrumental. He brought in, twice yearly design critiques, where everybody in the company at the time, that was about 150 designers at the time, would come in. This is before my time, would come in and do critiques of the work of the industrial designers. What many people don't know is that there's also a history of the software part of the company that also started around that same time, started actually on the West Coast of the United States. They really did work that probably isn't quite as admirable anymore. I mean, when you look at, the Selectric typewriter, that's still, because industrial design sort of lives on. The software design sort of just looks old because it was designed back then, and software changes so often. But we had that business basically as a separate part of the design of the entire company that wasn't ever really brought together until fairly recently, actually. So that period led to a period of a couple of different initiatives that, quite frankly, weren't very effective. They weren't very effective because they tended to focus on what designers were doing wrong, as opposed to actually trying to enable and infuse design in the rest of the company and educate the rest of the leadership in the company, for example. in the middle 90s, I was brought into the company, and I actually ended up bringing in user-centered design from an edited book that Don Norman had put out, basically an approach that I took the fundamentals of, and then I added elements to it, myself and my team at the time. So we took user-centered design, added things like making sure that our users in an enterprise environment typically don't make the decision to purchase or not, for example. So we actually decided to make our users work together with the decision makers, might be the CIO or somebody in the CIO organization within a client, and we'd actually get them to do the user studies together and actually discuss afterwards and like. That was one instance of that. We also did a whole lot of tooling. My team at the time built a whole lot of tools to be able to easily recruit users to be in our studies. We had some 10,000 users in this user recruit database. We also created from scratch a bunch of tools for task analyses and the like, for example. So a lot of work in that area. We also did education, had an educational experience for product teams, project teams, as well as even the executive team. And all that was really effective, other than the fact that we only had 230 designers at IBM total, right? So we were basically, using a lot of best practices, but we could only do it on very few products. So we did it on products, for example, like the ThinkPad. We took ThinkPad from about 8th in customer satisfaction to #1 in customer satisfaction with these user-centered design methods. But what we were missing was sufficient designers. In fact, at one point, I created this toolkit, basically a design toolkit, a design language, and an enabling toolkit. And the expectation was that developers would use this toolkit, and the toolkit itself would have been really well designed. So the componentry that software engineers would use to build a product, all the component parts would be incredibly well designed: visual design, interaction design, globalization, accessibility, all the rest of it. The only problem is that hypothesis was wrong. What we really needed to make sure is that we also had designers and researchers. So about 10 years ago, we got a new CEO at IBM, Ginny Rometty, and she really understood customers and the customer experience. And she was in a town hall literally around the corner from where I'm sitting now. She went sort of international after the first day on the job in New York, and then came to Toronto, which is where I'm based. And I listened to her talk, and literally the second sentence out of her mouth was that the customer experience was going to be central to her leadership of the company. So I thought, okay, you know what? This is the time we're going to really do well. So I basically did some research, internal research, on where we were with our design population. It turned out that of our 230 designers, some 56% of them were working on more than one product, and the average was 3. So you can't expect to get great results when you have that. But I didn't control that aspect of the company. I basically provided, and my team created the design systems and the like, and the tooling to enable it. But we didn't control kind of the headcount of designers. And so I was making the case for we needed to invest more heavily in design. We also looked at design practices. So we looked at our user-centered design work, some of the work that I'd done as well beyond that. But we came across this incredible implementation of design thinking that was done by a company that IBM acquired some 3 years prior to that. And they used design thinking for virtually everything the company did. And the guy that led that effort, his name is Phil Gilbert. And Phil really was a special kind of guy. He has, I would describe the word audacious as his, and inspirational as the kind of characteristics that would describe him with. And he and I and a guy named Charlie Hill also early on started to work together to make the case for what this new thing would look like in terms of really taking up the mantle of leadership across the company. So he had actually done work in the business unit that he was acquired into, and he led that group, and he used this form of design thinking really effectively. In fact, simplified a product portfolio from 44 down to 4 in 1 year while increasing revenue, right? So there was something magical going on with what Phil and the team was doing. So our CEO, Ginny Rometty, asked Phil, what do you think? Could you do the same thing that you did for that business unit for the rest of IBM? He said, I don't know, but I'll give it a go. And so we basically started down the path of really powering this whole company and really increasing the number of designers, professionally trained visual designers, interaction user experience designers, researchers, service designers and industrial designers, et cetera, to the point where we originally were intending to hire about 1,000, 2,000. Now we're in north of 3,000 designers as well, really using this advanced version of design thinking that maybe we can talk a little bit more about a little later, what is sort of different about it. But that was sort of the history of design at IBM, according to me.
Oh, that's great, and you touched upon some very interesting things that I would like for us to unpack a little bit more as we go on with our conversation. But let me ask you the following. Well, let me start with the following. So you have a very unusual background for a person who ended up leading design at one of the greatest companies on the planet. After Elliot Noyes, you practically led the second coming of design at IBM and introduced the IBM design unit. Now, you do not come from a traditional design background. So tell me a little bit about your personal career journey. How did you find your way to the field of design and then to IBM?
It's actually interesting to look at the leaders of design in many companies, actually. And I do, as you know, a fair bit of work with Don Norman. He and I also have observed this, that a lot of the leaders of design across many companies are non-traditional designers in terms of their background. So in my case, I started off in cognitive science, basically, and then also did a lot of work on clinical psychology early on. And it was actually my work in those areas that led to kind of an interesting realization. So all of my experiments that I was running at the university were run by computer. And I would work with, psychiatric patients, for example, but all the stimuli that was presented in the experiments I ran were run by computer. And so I did an advertisement for a research assistant that would need to know something about computers. And I advertised at the university that I was at, the University of Toronto. And I only got male students applying for this RA position. I thought that was kind of weird. That what's going on here? So I decided to investigate that. And it turns out that there was significant gender differences in computer use. This was the late 1980s, around that time. And it turned out that looking at the results of even computer use by children, that boys would actually literally push the girls off the computer at school, that kind of a physical difference and the like. Also looked at computer advertising. Was that biased? Yep, it was too. And so I started to go down the path of saying, well, how could we actually address this more? And so I started off just trying to look at the gender difference. And I decided to create an instrument called the sort of the computer anxiety sort of inventory. And I was able to select people that were really highly anxious and ones that weren't around computers. I also then started to look at the actual user interface. What kind of things were in the kinds of UIs that we were seeing at the time? And how could we change the UI design to ameliorate this difference basically between people that were anxious and non-anxious when dealing with computers, and especially for women. And so I created all these different conditions, different UIs, and I evaluated them with both self-report as well as psychophysiological measures, basically heart rate and galvanic skin response. And the results were amazing. That once you actually had UIs that were tailored to, and what we were manipulating largely was the kind of feedback we were giving. So at the back then, if you did something wrong, all you got was an error message. There was nothing ever positive or enjoyable about software back then. So decided to flip that around, to actually eliminate the negative, or at least not make it as negative, and also to change the design of the actual software to make it more enjoyable. So less negative experience, more positive experience. And it was interesting that on self-report and these psychophysiological measures of anxiety, basically, it determined that you could completely eliminate the anxiety response in women and men. So I presented that at a conference, and it was interesting. I got a telephone call I presented at a conference, and I also was then approached by the press to do interviews actually about this research. It got onto the wire services. I did radio interviews and TV interviews, and turns out that somebody at IBM had heard about those and called me up and said, have you ever thought of working for IBM? And I said, actually, honestly, no. But I had read a book about the founders of IBM, and I was fascinated by them. And the book actually talked about the kind of culture the IBM company had. Partly the focus on design, but also focused on just care and, about the individual. There's a story in the book about that Watson, the founder's senior, was running a big sales event out under a tent, and he found out about that there was and they were all men in the audience. Basically, he found out that one of the men there, that his wife was in labor, having a baby, and here he was at this meeting, and he made a big demonstrable sort of effort to fly in a helicopter and say, you're going to fly over and be with your wife during the delivery of your baby. And for everybody else here, you got to get some balance between your work life and your personal life. And so that kind of stuff really stuck with me, and said, okay, I'll go for the interview. Went for the interview. My lab at the university was not very impressive. The labs that IBM had were. So we started talking about salary, and I said, okay, you know what? I can do this non-academic job for a year. And I did for a year, and then I basically got to continue that on for the last almost 35 years. And at the time, I was hired to change the company because the company was in the process of breaking up during a time that all the parts of the company, and so the Canadian part of the company, the software part of the company, was going to become its own independent software vendor. And they figured they needed to amp up the focus on design. So I was hired to make that change. What was interesting was the guy that hired me, the vice president of manufacturing and development, hadn't told anybody else that he expected me to do that. And so the first little while was a little rough, but then I got the opportunity to really lead. So I led by using the introduction that I told you about earlier, the user-centered design work. I did 5 pilot studies with that. And we didn't even get done with the pilot studies. And the guy that headed up software at the time at IBM globally said, I want to hear about this thing you're doing. So I presented that. He said, okay, now you got responsibility for this across all of software. And then our then CEO found out about it, wanted to hear about it as well, and told him about it. And he actually said, this user-centered design stuff makes so much sense. What do people do without it? Do like engineers make it up? I said, yeah, that's actually the thing that we're replacing. But getting back to your fundamental question about sort of the non-traditional, the work that I did in cognitive science and in psychology research, and research and statistics and like were all my minors in graduate school. And so my real expertise was really in design research or user experience research, and that is now, as we'll get to a little later, that's actually what I now run at IBM as well. But so, and I'm a firm believer in that, and this is part of another initiative that you and I are part of as well, Joko, that I think we need to have a broader perspective on the kind of skills that designers and design leaders need, that you can't just have this unitary, focused on one specialization, that the more broad you are, especially as a leader, the more effective you can be in leading design as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Absolutely agree on that. So many interesting topics here touching upon that I'm really glad we're gonna continue unpacking some of this, Carol. Well, you did pioneer the use of user-centered design at IBM very early on, and you have done this so well that I have been using your work as a case study of best practice in my book Research for Designers since the first edition. Now, you just told us how this came to be, but tell me, what did your work in this area meant for IBM moving onwards from there? How things started changing at IBM?
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that, and when we're talking about kind of maturing an organization, you basically need to have everybody else that's around you understand these methods. Whether we're doing the user-centered design work, I specified that you needed to have a multidisciplinary team. I created one role that was the total user experience leader on the team. But what started happening with this, and you always have to watch when the focus of the initiatives that you're leading get watered down and redefined. And so user-centered design ended up being called UCD, and UCD lost its meaning. And so there was one instance when our CEO at the time had asked one of the product teams, are you using UCD? And they said, yes, we're using the UCD API. No, that's not what we're actually talking about. So it lost its meaning somewhat. And when I said that I required a multidisciplinary team back then, and that I had this one leader for it, everybody ended up calling that leader not the total user experience leader, but the UCD leader, and that ended up just being the UX designer. And so rather than having a true feeling of a multidisciplinary team, many of the other teams beyond the main ones that I was working on, that lost its focus. So when we started the focus on our new design program 10 years ago with Phil, we expressly made sure that we didn't ever abbreviate the term. Initially IBM design thinking, that became enterprise design thinking. We purposely didn't, for the first while, actually abbreviate it so it wouldn't lose its meaning. We also early on, by the way, wouldn't let any executive in the company take our charts in the source format so they could actually change it. We only gave them PDF versions because we didn't want to change, not have the effectiveness of the message and like. So there's a lot of stuff you have to be very careful of when you introduce this kind of material. So I think during the user-centered design days, had we had more designers at the time, I think we would have been more effective than we were. But it's also that, when Phil took on his role as general manager of, like 10 years ago, he recently stepped down, and we have this other phenomenal general manager now by the name of Katrina Alcorn. But Phil was a serial entrepreneur, and he took a serial entrepreneurial perspective on how to change a company. His view, he never really articulated it this way, but he had the view that, a 111-year-old company can be as agile as a startup. So why not make changes more quickly? So he would be really impatient with like, well, why can't we do that? And so there was and that's what I meant about that word audacious, right? That I think that there were some decisions that were made that were truly like, let's just really do this quickly, and let's really have the expectation that everybody's going to be doing this work. So a key part of the work we did during the user-centered design days, and we really amped it up even further when we did the design thinking kind of work, was educating all the relevant players. So we would, during the design leadership work that we did with regard to the last 10 years, we made sure that even though there was an expectation to do online education at the time, we said, no, we're going to need to have people fly to Austin, Texas. That was our major studio. That 2 architects, 2 designers, 2 product managers would all need to fly for their project team down to Austin, Texas for a week. And we had like about 3 or 4 teams all going at the same time for that same week. They brought their work with them, and they would work on using these methods that we'd use. They would work with their existing product, and absolutely adamantly negative senior software architects that I knew were anti doing this kind of work would come out of that and say, you know what? I've been working on this product for 8 years. In a 15-minute design thinking exercise, I got more clarity on what I need to be doing for my product than those 8 years of working on this, right? They completely got a totally different perspective. They really got an almost evangelical sense of this is an approach that we wanted to use. But so now we have those people. They're now going to be going back to their teams. We also needed to make sure that the leaders, that the executives knew what their roles were, right? And we then did a whole lot of education with regard to them, realizing how you needed to do education for senior executives. You need to do it actively, engage them the whole time and the like. And I had experience doing that. I teach an executive MBA course and also teach work at a director's college. So I'm familiar with that kind of audience. We need to gear the appropriate education that way. We're doing another rev of it now, by the way. I should make that point, that there is usually a turnover in a company over the period of a 10-year span of time. And so you also need to be able to redo some of this work as well to make sure that you've got a current active sense of what everybody needs to do. And you don't need to just teach them design thinking, by the way. You also need to just tell them and let them experience what their senior executive role is in managing projects that involve designers and design, right? So we used to have a course that was called the Advocate course, and I changed that, but I said, I don't need to have executives be advocates for design. They need to own design, right? Whether they're a product manager, whether they're a head of product, whether they're a general manager or senior vice president, they need to own the overall approach. So you have to understand the metrics in there. You have to understand what the processes are that designers are going to use and the like. So the lesson is that you need to, on a regular basis, refresh the whole focus, on the approaches that you take and make sure that everybody's still aligned.
Wow.
That's some great insights. Both you and I really appreciate design research, and we use it and we practice it. And we do understand the value of design research. But how important is design research to IBM? I was also curious about that, because this is type of work that often tends to sit behind the scenes. It's less visible. People less know about how design research is used to inform design decisions. So I was quite curious to understand how the company itself at large views the role that design research has to play.
I find this really interesting, actually. I think that the ascendancy of design over the last 10 years, probably 15 years, has been really, really cool. And when I think about, 15 years ago, maybe 17 years ago, when I used to run workshops at all the design conferences, I would do a show of hands, everybody in the room that is the only designer in their company, right? It was often the case that they were 80% of the room would be the only designer in their company. That's just not the case anymore, right? The ascendancy of design has made sure that many companies have many designers now, right? What's interesting is that research isn't in the same state. I think research is now having its ascendancy in terms of its importance, the fact that we need to hire many more of them. And IBM is a case in point. So when we were hiring the 3,000 designers, our focus early on was visual design, user experience design. Our focus with regard to research was slower in coming to the realization that we needed to have this work done. We also had directors of design, vice presidents of design, a general manager of design. We had no executive positions whatsoever in the company for research, right? Until my position. So my general manager currently, Katrina Alcorn, had the vision to realize that that's what we needed to amp up in the company. Now, where did she get that? She truly is a designer, and she appreciated the need to do research. So when she took her job about a year ago, she spent the first 3 months listening, doing sessions, running surveys, and getting a reading on what the challenges were. What did we need to fix and further amp up the design program that we had at IBM that was already an amazing program? How do you take an amazing program, make it better? Well, you understand deeply, using research, what the challenges are. And the number one challenge was actually research, that we needed to make sure that we were doing more effective research with more researchers and way more focused on what we're doing, and that it needed to have a seat at the executive table and even the senior executive table. And so she created this new position called Vice President of Client Insights. And by the way, even the naming of that was that it wasn't the focus on only research. I mean, I use the title Client Insights and Research, but her focus is on the client insights part. So it's not just you need to do the research, you need to actually have the end point of the insights that are actually going to make the changes. And so since I took on the role, and I had this kind of ideal background of knowing the company so well, and my true, as we talked about earlier, expertise really is in the area of research. And so I was chosen to do that role after apparently a quite extensive external and internal search. And then when I took the role over, or not over, it's a brand new person in the role, brand new role. I also spent, again, it's been about 3.5 months now since I've been in the role. And of course, I took a researcher's mind and method to that as well. So I did a listening tour around the major locations that I've got researchers, and also looked at what the challenges we have there. And we're now working on that. So there's a list of challenges that we have that we got from research that we need to fix in order to amp up the focus on research. And as an example, to more effectively at a vice president level, understand what challenges we have in the business that we need to apply research to. So some teams were just used to doing evaluative research, usability studies, for example, right? Just fine if that's what you really need. But if it's just, you hammer, so you have a hammer, so everything is a nail kind of approach. And some of the work was like that, not all of it, but just some of it was like that. And I'm saying, let's stand back and say, what actually do we need to have the research done on? And increasingly, it's also focusing on understanding ethnographic methods, generative research methods, to be able to really deeply understand the people that we're trying to serve, what those unmet needs are, what new elements that we need to add to existing product roadmaps, and even what new products do we need. Drive that with research, and also drive brand new products. So I've actually, one of my departments now that I just created is working with are incubators. So we actually have 3 product incubators. They're like startups inside the company. And I want to drive them with and from generative research that says, hey, this is the work we did. These are the kind of missing pieces, and this is what we need to be doing. So we look at everything. I've got one team that looks at our whole, buying funnel, if you will. The discover, learn, try, buy processes. We look specifically at that across, the company. Other ones build tools and the like as well. But so to answer your question, sort of why did we need this and what status is it at? We needed to have it at the same level as design is. And that actually is one of the things that we discovered when we did that listening tour, is that researchers were feeling like research was kind of subservient to design, when in actual fact it should be 4 in a box. And research should be equal to design. And some of the time we need to be doing work more closely with, product management to determine what we need to be building, as opposed to how we're actually designing it, as well.
Let me share something with you before I move on to the next question, which I think you're probably going to find it interesting. So in my current role, I lead it's a government-funded program that I lead, which is called Digital Futures. And we just funded by the state government of Victoria in Australia. So a few weeks ago, I was invited to this government conference, and it's a closed door, only for public sector employees. I got to participate as well due to the nature of the work. And the theme of the conference is digital transformation. So you have all the major, all the government agencies and units are present there, everything from the state police to the health department. It opens up with a ministerial address. So it's a very high level. It's a very serious conference. And it's a very interesting thing that's happened. So they put on a stage. It was very well produced, I have to say. I was actually quite impressed. So they had on the stage sitting different heads of these different government agencies, and they're conducting a live survey with their own employees. So they were like about 100, 200 of their employees sitting in the audience, and we were all on different tables as well. And they asked 4 questions related to digital transformation that they asked people to respond. What do you think are your biggest challenges in delivering digital transformation in the government? And one question was, is it the budget? The other question was, is it technology issue? Third question was, is it employee issue? And 4th question was, is it understanding your clients, means the public? So people are responding as they're sitting. And in terms of budget, 0 issues. Budget, not an issue at all. In terms of technology, 0 issues. Technology, not an issue at all. And it comes 50-50 to understanding the needs of their own and the challenges of their own employees, and understanding the needs of the clients, which is the public. 50-50 about came. And the conclusion that came about that, so all the heads of these government agencies, they concluded at the end, they said, we have to stop treating digital transformation as an IT project. It is a people's project. And I thought that was brilliant conclusion to this particular session. It really showed the need of understanding people when it comes to dealing with technology, because technology is no longer an issue. Technology is the tool, and we have all the technology we need. What we do need more is people who understand people and can translate it into insights for the organizations.
Yeah,
that's
a perfect example, Joko. I love it. I think that, and there are just so many instances of that, but so many people don't understand that. And I think that the challenge of really solving that is now to do, like in that case, to doing some really good research, to be able to say, these are the insights, especially the ones that are non-obvious. It's like, you know what? This is the challenge, right? I was doing and that applies to everything. So I'm on a board of directors of a nonprofit, And I did a workshop with them and said, okay, you know what, with our constituents, listening to who it is that we're serving is the magic of how you can actually serve this thing, right? I did a session last Friday of a workshop with students that were former students and alumni of our EMBA program that I teach in. And then in the afternoon, I worked with faculty in terms of what we're going to be doing about it. And I was saying the whole time that we got to listen deeply to what we just heard from students, that universities aren't used to that either in terms of working that way, nor are these nonprofits either. So I just think it's across the board that we need that deeper understanding of who it is that we want to serve. Also, the other thing I would add is a lens on, this is the way I put it, who do you want to serve? Learn, what do they do today? What are you going to now do to change the way what they're doing today that's going to make their lives amazing? And how are you going to evaluate how effectively you do that? If it seems so dead simple, but very few organizations actually buy into that or actually do it, even though they might agree to that that's the right way to go. Very few of them are actually doing that really effectively. So yeah, great example, Joko.
Yeah, I mean, even my current role, it's a really interesting example of that, because I'm a designer, design researcher, and a social scientist, right, but actually leading an enormous team of research labs, centers, and institutes from STEM subjects. So I work with mathematicians, I work with computer scientists, I work with engineers. There are no designers whatsoever. And even in my role, I'm not here as a designer. I'm here as a director to lead this unit, essentially, which is quite interesting. And my argument has always been that we need people that, we need that human aspect when it comes to dealing with technologies, because otherwise technology for technology's sake is useless. So if we are really committed to make some transformation, if we are really committed to have an impact, and this is the mandate that we have from the government, we have to advance society and the economy of this that we're serving, we really need to approach it from that human-centric perspective. So, so I think that we will see these changes, and they're coming, they're not coming as fast, but I think that once they start coming, they will be far more present. And I think even the work that you do is really pioneering, has been a trailblazing for many people. I have certainly learned a great deal from your work at IBM, and I will continue learning from you. So thank you for all those things, Carol. Let me move on to the next question then, as well. When you started, as you said, IBM had a bit more than 200 designers, and now IBM has around 3,000 designers and staff, and almost 100 design studios globally. And IBM is the single largest company in the world with so many designers and staff, which is pretty incredible. But what were the decisive factors that inspired such massive recruitment campaign? You touched upon a little bit on that earlier. Do you mind unpacking this a bit further?
Sure thing. Yeah, we actually approached this, and this was really Phil Gilbert's brilliance, that we wanted to establish the ratio of designers to coding developers in software. And we said that the ratio should be 1 to 8, 1 to 12, around that. And at the time, we were anywhere between, depending on what part of the organization, 1 to 50, 1 to 70, that kind of a ratio. And so we said, okay, you know what? A team needs to have this 1 to 8 to 12 ratio. And when we hired designers in, and I should point out, and this was again Phil's insight, we created a single design department, basically, or a business unit, that all the designers were hired into. That business unit carried the budget for all of these designers, and we made the decisions. And so I was in charge of professional hires, for example. Early on, there were several of us, like 3 or 4 of us, had many jobs. So I had also the job of recruiting professional hires, and another colleague of mine did college hires. And we only had to make two decisions. Only two people needed to agree that we needed to hire a particular employee. In the past, there was all kinds of red tape. They call it blue tape at IBM. And it would take way too long to make a decision. And if you took too long, then that potential employee might already be gone to somewhere else. So we shortened the decision tree to hiring. We also had fly downs. We had 10 people fly to Austin, Texas every Friday for these interviews. And we did the interviews in a really interesting way. They basically had the candidate sit in a room. They didn't go anywhere, but we rotated people through. And those of us who were doing the interviewing would all choose one aspect. One would look at the portfolio. I created this design challenge that they ended up having to do as well. And we would each dig in. We would interview them for 45 minutes, and then 15 minutes we would all huddle in terms of the next person go in. Could you actually look into this aspect or whatever? Really, really great, process. The other thing was that we then deployed these designers on projects that were established by talking to the most senior business executive of the business unit. So we basically say, what's your most important? Well, the original ones, to be honest, were chosen by our CEO. So the first 7 projects we worked on were chosen by Ginny Rametti at the time. And we would say, for example, in staffing those projects, that you could only do the project once you had sufficient design staffing. And we wanted to avoid this notion of, well, if we now hired an extra 100 designers, we weren't going to spread them evenly across hundreds and hundreds of products. No, we were going to get this ratio. You could only have our designers if you had the sufficient number of designers on the project that we specified with this ratio. So that also guaranteed that we would have good results in those projects as well. And we also had actually a criterion of, I think, 6 to 8 things that the projects that came into this thing that was called the Hallmark program at the time, what criteria they needed to meet. Like, for example, they couldn't be a troubled project. It couldn't be that they're almost about to ship, had to be at the beginning of the project. It needed to have senior executive support and the like. So we had a bunch of those kinds of criteria. So we increased the likelihood of these early projects being successful. And then after we did this for a while, we also then took and realized that these business units were getting these designers for free because we carried the budget for all of that in our group, right? And I think it was about 2 or 3 years into the program that we decided that, you know what, they're now seeing the value enough. Now we can actually have them carry, the cost of the designers. And that move then also made sure that they were now, really taking it seriously, because now they have to pay for it as well. And then what happened after that? How do we still ensure that we were getting the right focus? We end up doing these program reviews with, like, the general managers, for example, and we'd had this a chart deck that needed to be created that would, for example, take all the products in that part of the business in decreasing order of importance. And then we would calculate the number of designers they had to determine how many products they could afford to have designers on, right? And so there might be 8 projects that they could, with this ratio, they could actually have designers fully on. And the conversation with the senior executive would be, well, they'd say, no, these other projects are really important too, that we've got to have designers on. Well, then you got to hire more designers. So a lot of that, that would amp up designers in a particular business unit to the tune of 100, 200, 300, just as a result of that meeting, to go through and say, you know what, if you want to work on more of these, we kept our eye on that ratio, right? So it's stuff like that that made the difference as we move forward as well.
Fascinating. I'm always curious about the inner workings of how things come to be, So thanks for the additional information. So you also developed the IBM Global Academic Program for Design, and you use this program to engage with many design schools and universities. These engagements eventually led to the introduction of the Future of Design Education initiative that you and Don Norman established together. I had the pleasure of working with both of you on this project, but I never really asked you, why was the corporate leadership at IBM so interested in advancing design education?
Yeah, actually, it was a conversation that I had with Phil Gilbert. So I had already been teaching. I taught a pan-university design course. I did one for the medical school. Also did the business school and the like. And it's just been my passion to teach. I mean, I was originally going to be an academic, right? So hired right out of my PhD program. And so so I've always had the passion to teach. I've been teaching, and at one point, I should also just mention that during the 10 years, I basically, in working with Phil and for Phil, the first year he said, Carl, you know what? I don't know IBM very well, but you do. Why don't you introduce this new design program that we've got around the rest of our product labs around the world? So I took a year and flew around the world to each of our labs and did like town hall presentations. I met with the executives in that location, met with the design team there, I asked for the people that would be the most against this approach. I wanted to have one-on-ones with them and the like. So I did that for a whole year. And then after that year, and it was actually during a performance review meeting that we spent all of like 5 minutes on. And I said to Phil, we should be using this form of design thinking for our consulting practice. And he said, yeah, good idea. Do you want to go do it? I said, yeah, sure. So for another year, I flew around the world again and really introduced this to, our consulting practice. And they've done an amazing job with it as well. The next year, I said, you know what? I'd like to use this method to inject into the way that we sell, to get our sales teams to work this way as well. So I created with a team, I created basically enterprise design thinking for sales. And so I spent 2 years, doing that. One that had a dedicated program, a dedicated team of mine. I did it together with somebody else. And that had amazing results. The next year we did some more work, on that. And we tried to hit all of our top client teams. And it was sort of like train the trainer type thing, as opposed to dedicated staff. And what was interesting about that is I did the observations about that and recommended, when I was asked, that what we should be doing in our sales function is, yes, do the salespeople need to understand these approaches? Yes. But if we really want to be effective, we should be hiring designers into our sales organization to do this work themselves, right? So we've hired some 120, 150 designers in a new part of the company called client engineering that has designers in it. Now, I mean, it wasn't only my influence. There were other things that led to that organization to be set up, but mine was one of the inspiring kind of elements that led to it. And so I did all of that work. And then Phil and I got together and he said, you know what, Carl, you've been doing all this education and this teaching at university and the like, tell me about it. So I had one meeting where I just walked him through everything that I was doing. He said, this is amazing. Do you want to go do this as a primary thing? Why don't you reach out, create a whole new program, working with, the top design schools and universities, and put a whole program together. So I basically said, okay, so I looked at all the rankings of design schools and universities. I chose which ones it was going to work with. I would determine which of our design executives and leaders were alums of some of these schools. So, and then I made them a design focal with that school. We'd have a relationship with them. I typically would have a meeting first with the president of design school, for example, or the dean of a design program in a university. We'd have a conversation about, here are 10 different things we could do collaboratively together. Which of these do you think are interesting? Everything from doing, keynotes about, or panel sessions of what professional design actually look like, or we could, co-teach. We could also even work and workshop in terms of with faculty. There were a variety of things that we could do, and every school would choose which of these things they would want to do together. And we did that work, and I did a bunch of capstones with a number of other programs as well. And those programs still continue on. I'm not leading them anymore, but they're still continuing on. But one of the schools that we were working with was University of California, San Diego. where Don Norman happened to be the head of design. And so I spent a weekend there. We're also doing a design competition that they were doing. And he and I were talking about the state of design education. And we said, you know what? I think it needs to be amped up. And both of us independently had this view that we really needed to not at every school, but across the board, my experiences were that there were major holes in what it is that we needed to do. And so he and I started to talking about this, and then he flew to Toronto, where I am. We also had a long dinner together one night, mapping out who we would want to have, for example, Joe Coy, like you, to be on the steering committee and the like. And so we started to put that stuff together, how we wanted to approach doing this and the like. And then we basically launched this whole new program, basically with an intent to kind of level up education to make sure that we were addressing the needs of the 21st century, and that we were in many ways addressing the big challenges that we've got around the globe, but also even just taking core design education up a level, as well. And so that work, as you know, has been going on sort of ever since, and you were a huge contributor to it. So we thank you for that. And we're really looking now at kind of looking to wrap up and publish that work as well, and that's right in the process right now.
Yeah, thanks for having me on that program. That initiative. It was a fantastic experience. I really enjoyed actually, and meeting all the other people who were part of the steering committee and beyond, with the working groups, with the large working groups that we had, was absolutely fascinating experience. And we are still to wrap it up. We're still not done quite yet, but getting there. So that was quite amazing. Now, this also leads me to my next question. So I know that at IBM, you also developed a design bootcamp program, to which you often refer to as the missing semester of design school. And this is how partially, I think, your conversation with Don Norman started.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this. What does this program offer that most design schools don't?
Yeah, interesting question. And it really was when we were first starting, that 10 years ago, the reboot sort of our design program under the leadership of Phil Gilbert, we really said, what do we need in order to have these designers we're hiring be able to hit the ground running and be effective? Because a lot of the time in the past, you'd hire a designer and they'd have to be around for like a year or 2 years before they could actually really be effective. What could we put into a design program? And we also looked at, in fact, I did a study that looked at what kind of skills people were missing that we're getting from design school. So things like multidisciplinary collaboration. A lot of design schools consider multidisciplinary collaboration, meaning that visual designers work with UX designers that work with, inside the design profession. When in actual fact, the kind of multidisciplinary collaboration we needed was with, technologists and business people and the like. And a lot of people just had never had that experience. Incidentally, neither had any of those other disciplines. So you get somebody out of an MBA program, they have only worked with business people typically. If you're getting somebody out of a software engineering program or computer science program, they also typically in their programs have only done things inside that discipline, right? And what happens to those people? They have a bias about their own discipline. They each think they're the center of the universe, right? People out of an MBA program figure that business is the center. I mean, that's where the money comes from, and they understand the market, right? They're the most central, right? The people that are graduating from a computer science program, they're building this stuff. They're the center of the universe. Designers come out of it and say, well, actually, it's our design that makes the difference. When the reality, as you know, is it takes each of those disciplines to work really effectively together, to be able to even have a common vocabulary. A lot of the time, they just don't even understand each other's vocabulary, right? And so that was one element that we saw was a real limiting factor. Another one was even design thinking, and a lot of design schools won't even touch design thinking because they think that it has been a way of really taking design from designers and giving it to other disciplines, appropriating design, basically, right? And so there sort of has a whole negative perspective on design thinking. When in actual fact, and admittedly, I did a keynote at a university, and the dean of business actually said, "But Carl, with design thinking, we don't need designers anymore, do we?" I said, no, come on, you don't get this. It's just a way of thinking that everybody should have, and a particular level of priorities and empathizing and collaborating. Of course, you still need designers and all the disciplines of design, but that again is another element but designers need to work that way too, and actually be able to know those methods, to be able to work with their colleagues effectively. So that was another one and another one was working on wicked, real world problems. A lot of time we were seeing design schools working on, the student could choose their own project that they're going to work on, which usually was really simple and wasn't necessarily representative. Now, again, there are many exceptions to this. Like lots of schools were doing things better on any one of these things, but very few schools were doing all of those things, right? And also, we wanted to basically infuse in these people that we were hiring kind of understanding of the kind of technologies we had at IBM, the kind of ways, the way a company works, the cultural sort of elements of it. And so the design boot camps were initially about a 3-month period, and that's why it ended up being kind of a semester sort of view. They're now about 6 to 8 weeks in what we do today. And it was always my intent, and you're right, when I had started to have those conversations with Don, my perspective was what do companies like mine need from design schools? And we talked a little bit from the IBM perspective as well on making sure that we build ethics into the work we're doing, that we build environmental focus on it, which I think all designers need to have as well, and make sure that we have diversity as a focus. Don very much even saw that as a bigger sort of focus, right? And so we both had a different, slightly different perspective. We said, no, that's what we really need. But mine was really heavily influenced by the experience that we had here, and then my own teaching as well, that basically was saying that, in my view, all the members of a C-suite need to understand design and how to manage design, as I was saying earlier, right? And so it's interesting to note that our long 3-month program boot camp was for our new hires, right? But we also had another one, for our product teams, the ones that I mentioned earlier, and we had another one, as I mentioned as well, for our senior executives as well. Each one of them needed to have a boot camp, basically. So those are still going on, today. But that was part inspiration, as you said, for the future of design education work as well.
Mm. So interesting, the thing that you mentioned, like how insular each discipline tends to be, and how all disciplines think that they are center of the universe. So it's like the issue of sustainability. And we always assume that designers are really leading sustainability efforts, that we are such a great advocates of sustainability, especially, the new generation of designers nowadays and all that. So there is this event that Yale University holds, which is called Yale Sustainability Leadership Summit or something of sort. And I received a Yale scholarship to attend that and to be a part of that summit. So I was going there, and I was assuming, of course, it's going to be something which is a topic which I'm very familiar with, sustainability. So I thought it will be very interesting engagement. And they welcome me and they say, like, wow, this is the first time we are having a designer here. And, we had no idea designers are even at all interested in this area. And I'm like, what? Like, that's all we talk about all the time, sustainability. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the room, there were people who were dealing with UN on sustainability issues. There were negotiators on behalf of governments for different sustainability initiatives, and legislations that have to be moved on and stuff. And there were leaders from different energy industries. No one in that room ever had heard that designers are dealing with sustainability or at all have any interest in sustainability. For me, that was like, really interesting, because we always assume that we are such a big advocates, but then we don't really make that impact as we think we do. Since nobody there actually knows that we even do anything on that front, or that we are somehow, involved with that. So that was quite interesting for me. It was just that self-reflective thing that we are not really center of the universe.
I know, but even on the point that you're making about, sustainability, dealing with social issues, equality, all those lenses are really important to teach in design school. But it's also the case that some subset of those designers will do the work directly with the UN to be able to, use their skills to be able to directly affect the work that they're doing. But it's my point of view that all designers should be doing this in the work they do as designers for the companies that they work for, or the organizations that they're working for. And they also, in my view, need to be doing it and using their skills to improve the world, just as a calling. I made a point, I did a keynote 3 years ago now at the Design for America. And what was interesting was I said, there are these big challenges we have in the world that I think that designers should take on in addition to their day jobs, right? What was interesting was literally 3 months after that keynote, COVID hit. And we said, okay, you know what? I got together with Srini Srinivasan, who was the president of the World Design Organization, got together with Design for America and the leaders there, and with IBM. And we had some 250, 300 designers that took a bunch of design challenges and used our design methods right around the world. I mean, this was literally 17 design time zones around the world, and worked on solving particular problems that we thought, designers could have an impact on. An amazing experience. And a lot of the designers that were part of that said, you know what, number one, it was great to be able to work with people all around the world on something so meaningful. But it was also really great to see what we could deliver, and that how designers could make a huge difference in applying their skills and their techniques and practices to really challenging problems. So everything from how could we inspire people to do, safe behaviors? Well, designers are good at doing advertising, so it's like an ad basically. So we create a whole bunch of those. We had other ones where it was like, doctors and nurses that needed to go into the ICU for the first time, that weren't aware of like how to put on the safe equipment properly. That was like I think 17-page PDF or whatever. We made designs to be able to do that work more effectively. And then even things like, there was a whole lot of domestic abuse that was happening. And in particular, we looked at India, and there was a team in India, in the rural communities in India. The team came up with a particular signature, a particular design that was like an equal sign with a cross through it, that was indicative of this hut or whatever has problems, and the women could secretly put it on the door, and then have others, help or whatever. This phenomenal, work being done over 3 weeks with these teams that were working independently. But it was one of those things where it was like, see, we can make a difference, with this kind of work. And I've done a number of things like that, ever since. So I think that these kinds of things should be a focus on what we do every day. So we have, like at IBM, we also have a enterprise design thinking for sustainability set of extensions. So if you're going to do like a stakeholder map, one of the stakeholders is the earth. So you're always thinking about that and what you're doing, for example. We also have a whole product division that's sustainability now. That's all focused on that work. So you can do it as your day job. But my view is that we as designers need to also be applying it over and above our day jobs, because we have these skills that can really make a difference in the world.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. Like often my students, former students, when I was teaching design and all that, will tell me, we really believe in sustainability. We really want to make a change. And that's why we don't want to work for that or that company, because they don't have good sustainable policies. And I said, maybe that's exactly why you should go and work for those companies. And you should drive that change from within, not from throwing rocks at the walls, so you should go and inquire and be a part of the solution there rather than just ignoring that, because maybe just they don't know how to do that. Maybe they need somebody from within to inspire them to do a better job or to show them the way. So it's very interesting. And
yeah.
the work that the World Design Organization has been doing with Srini and so on has really done a very good job at elevating and introducing design to these other impact areas where designers can make a change. So I think that this has been probably one of the best efforts that we have seen in the field at large, like on that level, elevating the work and the contributions that we can make. So these were great examples. Thanks for that. And now I want to ask you the last question of our session for today, which is related to design leadership specifically. And this is how does IBM appoint and promote designers to leadership positions? And what are the traits and the skills that are being most sought after at IBM in this area?
Another great question, Joko. And I think it's probably important to point out we have dual track. So you basically have a managerial track and you have an individual contributor track that goes all the way up. And the individual contributor track is one that I helped create. Charlie Hill, our IBM fellow, actually was the one that most worked initially on the definition of this whole career path. And I actually ran it for the last 3 years as well, a board that evaluates people to go through these levels. So we basically have all of one of the other things that we did 8 years ago was to put an actual design career path in IBM. Before this, designers were just a subclass of software developers or hardware developers or consultants. And we put this work together to say, no, there has to be this separate career path. And we have specializations within design, and we keep that up on a regular basis. I just added, so my previous job was actually responsible for the design profession. So determining, okay, well, we put in systems of design, for example, we just put in motion design, we just put in, so that's an evolving set of specializations in design. But then you basically can go up the different band levels of individual contributor, and that's largely done within each business unit. But then you get to basically a level that's called band 10, which is what we're calling design principal. So design principal has the responsibility for design or research across largely a business unit. And that level requires you to go through a very rigorous evaluation process. It's kind of like tenure in the universities, that kind of a equivalent, where you basically write a document together with your manager or your nominating executive. And it asks questions like, what have you done? What impact have you had on the company with what you do? What internal eminence do you have? What external eminence do you have? What unique contributions you've made to the profession? And then also what, endorsements do you have from important people, internal and external to IBM? And then you also create a portfolio. And I always say it has to be the best design work of your career to tell your story arc of you as a designer or as a researcher, right? And both of those are then reviewed by an evaluation committee, basically a design leadership board. Actually, I created a separate one for each of the 4 major sections of the company. And they do the original reviews, and then we take it up to this corporate level design leadership board that I used to run. And they basically go through, and these are the existing leaders and executive leaders in the company, then do the reviews of that work. And the ones that really make the grade are then promoted to that design principal. And then we have two other levels above that. Distinguished designer is another level above that, which is now a role that takes a particular area of focus and does that across the whole company. So we have one example. So Adam Cutler at our organization is responsible for basically AI design. That was his specialization. He was going to do it for all the company. And that is a similar process, except there's now a higher bar to reach. And then above that, on the individual contributor line, there is no difference between design and any other technology profession. It's called the IBM Fellow. And IBM Fellow then is again, a company-wide sort of resource. That's on the technical path, what we call the technical path or individual contributor path. And then we've got the managerial path that goes from, program director up to director, up to vice president, and then up to general manager, basically, is what we have. And those are also determined by kind of span of control. How much do you influence? How much of the company success are you responsible for, and the like? And also, again, your capabilities. And the way that you do those is you need to do a panel presentation. In that case, it's sort of you need to, if you were in this role, what would you do? And then you get grilled in that case by a committee that gets put together with regard to what challenges they challenge what it is that you're doing and ask additional questions, and then the best get chosen for that level as well. In fact, my general manager Katrina Alcorn just recently wrote a Medium article about that very thing, what the process is for getting up the managerial executive path at IBM and elsewhere as well. And you can have a look at my LinkedIn or whatever. I point to that article as well.
I've read that one actually. It was quite interesting, which is why I was curious to take your to get your take on that as well, because it did seem like a very, very rigorous process, and I wanted to understand a little bit more about it. It's quite fascinating actually. I never would have quite imagined the extent to which IBM has taken this promotion process internally. So thank you for sharing that behind the scenes.
Joko, I should just mention, Joko, that it's when we first put it together, the company already had a promotion process for individual contributors, for example, on the technology side. So computer science and software development, and also even hardware development. And so we made sure when we created ours that ours was going to be as rigorous or more than theirs was. And we have over the years, compared notes, and increasingly recently, by the way, their program, meaning the software program for, let's say, are taking more ideas from the way that we've done ours to further enhance theirs as well. But when we first started, we needed to make sure that we were on parity with theirs in order to give the same kind of title. So that's another thing to point out.
Yes, no, makes sense. That's to ensure that you're benchmarked accordingly, and across the board at the same level. So it adds further to the weight of the role itself that way.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Carol, thank you so much. This was a very fascinating, very interesting conversation that we just had. I very much enjoyed all your insights, and thank you again for sharing your experience with us.
I very much enjoyed it, and I love your approach to all this stuff, Joko, and the books you've written. I just want to acknowledge that as well. I think you're a major force, and I think your contribution to the future of design education as well. And I should also just point out that Meredith Davis is kind of the person that's pulling together all the work that we've been doing, and she's amazing as an overall design educator and leader as well. So an acknowledgement to her as well. But Joko, thanks so much for inviting me. And if anybody wants to follow up with me, just contact me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much. Enrico, thank you for hosting us today.
Thank you guys. So thank you everyone for watching, listening to this beautiful session that we had today with those big heavyweights of design. So I was Enrico Lisboa, the business design lead at Echoes, APAC and EMEA. We had Joko Muratovsky, our global design ambassador and Director of the Digital Futures at the Deakin University, and Karel Fredenberg, our IBM Global Vice President of Client Insight and Research. So if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. We can get it back to you. And thank you very much.